Welcome to this session, Sacred Pedagogies in Dialogue. My name is Isaac Calvert, and I'm here as kind of a moderator for this symposium. We have 5 student researchers. They're going to be each presenting a portion of the project. We have, maybe if you could kind of wave so they know who you are. We have Avery, she's waving. We've got Anna's waving over there in the white shirt. Jessica in the green here. We have Ariana, and we have Alyssa. So these are our five researchers. Just before we begin, I'm just going to introduce kind of the general idea of the project that we're engaged in, and then how the rest of this session is going to go is we'll give each of the 5 researchers a few minutes to kind of introduce their portion of the project. Then we'll have a dialogue between us with some questions. And then we'll have kind of an open question session at the end for a little more engagement there. So in a nutshell, this project is investigating a very particular dimension of religious education. So each of these researchers chose a primary source text within a particular tradition, and then reviewed that text, read it in exhaustive detail, and then using kind of qualitative research strategies, analyzed it thematically, looking for themes relating to prescriptions for teaching and learning and principles of education that are embedded in the text itself. The unique dimension of this research project is that we're not necessarily looking for the dimension of religious education that is confessional in nature, that is teaching the tradition itself and the content of the tradition, but those traditionally prescribed methods or modalities of teaching and learning that are contained and embedded in these traditions. Now, we recognize certainly, like, in discussing the value of this research as it's kind of extrapolated and expanded beyond the borders of the tradition to which they pertain, one cannot fully divorce or extrapolate the how of education from the why of education in these traditions. But certainly there are lots of lessons that we can learn from each of these traditions, especially through perhaps some of the Occidental lenses through which we are approaching this theme or this subject. To introduce it more in depth, I'd like to share my screen here for a moment and share with you a quote from a 2006 article by researcher Sebastian Gunther. This particular article is about medieval Islamic writings on the nature of teaching and learning and knowledge. And he begins his article with an introduction that kind of justifies why he began his research in that vein. And in a lot of ways, our justifications kind of dovetail with his. So as I read this, I invite you guys to maybe ask yourselves or kind of just ponder, to what degree do you see that this idea that Gunther presents is true in your experience, or what value might it bring to the study of religious education or education in general in your experience? And then maybe in the chat window, we could kind of begin a dialogue about kind of this perspective that Gunther puts forth, and then we could open it up for some questions and discussion. Okay, so here is the quote. I'll go ahead and read it, and again, please go ahead and start chiming in the chat window. So he begins: insufficient awareness of the educational achievements of the past bears the risk of not recognizing what is genuine progress in the field of education and what is mere repetition. In other words, without knowledge of the history of education, we may fail to achieve the level of understanding and reasoning reached by former generations, while at the same time keeping ourselves busy with self-postulated problems, the solutions to which have long been available in the stores of historical knowledge. Part of the issue is that there is a tendency in contemporary Western research on education to neglect theories, philosophies, and intellectual movements originating from cultures and civilizations other than an Occidental one. For instance, studies in education of the West are often concerned with the Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian foundations of the European-centered history of learning, while educational concepts and practices of other cultures and civilizations are not given adequate consideration. This is somewhat surprising in view of the complex challenges Western societies are facing at the beginning of the third millennium. In fact, an increasing ethnic and religious diversity in the population of nearly every large city in North America and Europe, and in most institutions of primary, secondary, and higher learning, seems to call rather urgently for a change in the approach toward education, both nationally and internationally. At the same time, it seems necessary to recognize fully that the study of educational thought is a key tool for a better understanding of culture, civilizations, religions other than our own. Now, certainly the kind of Occidentally centric viewpoints that he introduces are problematic in certain ways. But the point of sharing that quote is to say that despite kind of a traditional focus within a Western educational paradigm on particular portions of world history, there is a value, unique value to researching not just the content, but the prescribed methodologies of traditions of education, whether they be religious or otherwise. So in that vein, what we'd like to begin with is we'd like to open it up to maybe some comments about that that quote from Gunther. So what we'll do is divide into some breakout rooms for a second. We'll probably do 3, maybe 4, depending on how many people there are here, and just open up for some discussion. What merit do you see in this quote by Gunther, and have you seen any of that in your experience with textbooks or undergraduate education courses, survey courses on the history and philosophy of education or religious education? We'll take maybe 2 or 3 minutes in this breakout room for have people kind of discuss, and then we will bring it back together. Wonderful. Thanks again for your participation today in that little breakout session. I apologize if some of you were in the middle of a thought. It's hard to gauge where we're all at in these breakout sessions. But before we move on into the individual presentations, we'd love to maybe hear a couple of thoughts from you guys about this concept from Gunther, about the value of not just theological content from a multitude of traditions, but also theologically informed methodological approaches to teaching and learning. Does anybody have anything that they maybe were in the middle of sharing or would like to share with the whole group while we're here? Okay, maybe we got it all out in our breakout sessions then. That's fine. I guess we'll warm each other up a little bit more as we move forward. But please, as we're presenting, each of our 5 researchers are going to present about the sacred texts that they researched and a few principles and practices that are informed by this tradition and its text. Feel free to throw up some questions or some thoughts in the chat window as they come, and we will do our best to address them in the course of our meeting. So without any further ado, I guess we will begin by hearing from Jessica, and then we'll move from there. Each session will be about 5 minutes per presenter. So here we go. Go ahead, take it away, Jessica.
Thank you. So the tradition that I've been researching is Buddhism. And we had a tough go figuring out a primary text to study for this because there's a lot in the Buddhist canon and a lot of Buddhisms and just a plurality of texts and thoughts. But we ultimately decided to center our research on the Nadanakotha, which this text is the introduction to a larger text, the Jataka Tales, which is a collection of birth stories that the Buddha told about his past lives and his journey towards becoming the Buddha. And so the Nadanakotha centers on those stories that are central to his journey and his learning towards Buddhahood. So the author is unknown, and the date of this text being written is also unknown, but we do know it was a later addition to the canon. But the author quotes first the story of Sumedha from the history of the Buddhas and intersperses the stanzas with his own prose commentary or retelling of the story. And then he launches into some description of prior Buddhas and Gautama's interaction with them across different lives, and then concludes with the story of Buddha's life as Gautama and his journey towards Buddhism, and then a few of his teachings. The text was written in Pali, and the translation that we used was by Rice Davids, who was the founder of the Pali Text Society. So the interesting thing about this text is that it focuses a lot more on the mythology rather than the historicity. And so it's not necessarily giving specific dates or things to help ground you in what's going on or what's realistic, but rather it gives principles and tells the story in a way that demonstrates how the Buddha learned and reached the point that he reached. So just to kind of give you an idea of some of the things that we've pulled from this text, I'm going to share a couple principles and a couple practices. So the first principle that I pulled from the Nadanakotha is that in order to truly learn something, you have to become something rather than just grasping it with your mind. It's a process of doing things. Another theme or principle is that it is the learner's responsibility to seek out knowledge. There's a quote from the Nadanakotha where he talks about a man who has gotten dirty and he sees a lake. Then he says, if he seek not that lake, the fault is not in the lake. So when there exists a lake of nirvana that washes the stains of sin, if a man seek not that lake, the fault is not in the lake nirvana. So just this idea that there is a path and he recognizes there's a path to nirvana, and then it becomes his responsibility to seek out that path. A third principle is that there will always be opposition in learning. And so there's a requirement of resolve and effort to overcome that responsibility. And so that's a theme that comes throughout the text as the Buddha encounters some problem or recognizes the path that he's following is not quite right. He has to determine to try something new or to keep pushing through to overcome that opposition. And then some methods that we pulled out. The first is that it's so important to build off of past traditions. In the text, it talks about recurring things across different Buddhas prior to Buddha Gautama. One of the most instrumental of those is the 10 perfections, which are 10 requirements or qualities that each Buddha is required to develop before they can attain Buddhahood. And so as Buddha starts to comprehend this path to nirvana, he begins to study and practice these 10 perfections and build off of the things that he's perceiving from past Buddhas. He also builds off of the traditions already established in the area. He builds off of teachers that he goes to see, and then ultimately adapts all of those and puts them together to find the middle way or the correct path to learn what he needs to learn to achieve enlightenment. The second practice is the idea of sacrifice or giving up things that help you be comfortable or desires that you have that are not helpful, and letting go of those things in order to seek after what's really important. And then the last practice that I'm going to share with you today is the importance of testing out what you learn. That you can't just do it all in your mind. You have to practice, you have to ponder, and you have to try things out. So he continuously encouraged his students to do the things he taught them. He didn't want them to just accept everything he taught. He wanted them to go practice. And that's similarly what he did, is he tried all these different methods from different teachers and then adjusted them accordingly as he saw fit when it wasn't working in order to achieve enlightenment. So that's kind of a general overview of the Nadanakotha and some things I've pulled out from it.
Excellent. Thank you, Jessica. So as we go, each presenter is going to put in the chat window just a real quick bullet point list of the principles and practices that they kind of thematically analyzed from their text. So you can have that to kind of refer to in our discussion as we move forward. So just going to do that while Alyssa takes it away with her presentation.
So I studied Confucianism specifically in the form of the Analects, which is one of the books that his followers compiled after he died, of all the sayings and the conversations and the experiences that they had with him. So this tradition is really broad and has changed a lot over time, but I am referring to the tradition as found in the Analects. It was very important for Confucius to give people direction, but also to let them discover it for themselves. So one of the things about the Analects is that it's written with Chinese characters, and they were specifically vague. So the people who were reading it also felt as if Confucius was speaking to them. And there's many different translations. And so depending on what translation you use, if you're reading it in English, you can get entirely different sounding verses. And it's not a translation error. It's just a possibility that can happen. And that happens even when you're reading it in Chinese. You can take it multiple ways depending on the context that you assign it, which is a really cool way to learn, in my opinion, that part of the responsibility is that of the learner. And that is one of the common principles that is found in the Analects, is the student needs to have a desire to learn and to be willing to put in that effort. And there is a quote from the Analects in book 9, chapter 18, that says, learning may be compared to that what may happen in raising a mound. If there's but one basket of earth to complete the work, and I stop, the stopping is my own work. And it may be compared to throwing down the earth on level ground. Though but not one basket is thrown at a time, the advancing with it is my own going forth. So just explaining that if you stop part way, it's almost like you never started at all. But even just one effort, one basket at a time, it makes learning worth it and possible, even if it's just small, consistent efforts. Another principle that is found in Confucianism is that the way or the process of learning is different, but the same for everyone. And it explains that it's kind of like a thread, that the thread is all going in one direction. It's one piece of thread, but within that thread, there's individual strings. And so everyone is on a different path, but it's all the same path at the same time. And that even if someone's learning looks different from yours, or if they're in a different spot, they're progressing at a different pace, it's all part of the same process. And it's important to support each other as we go through that, which leads to kind of the overarching principle of virtue, and that they believe that everyone is born with this virtue, and through our actions, we're not gaining more virtue or losing virtue, but we're either clouding it or letting it really shine and becoming the best version of ourselves, where we can have that virtue really light our lives. Some methods that they have is to study culture and ritual, which can also be translated as propriety, or the order of things. And so they believe that the superior man learns multiple things and across all cultures and music and different types of learning, and then refines it through their rituals and through their beliefs, and they're able to apply it to their lives very specifically. As well as putting in effort beyond what the teacher tells you to do, like the quote before with how learning takes effort. Confucius said, I do not open up the truth to one who is not eager to get knowledge, nor help out one who is not anxious to explain it himself. When I presented one corner of a subject to anyone and he cannot learn the other three, I do not repeat my lesson. And so it's really about like that thirst for knowledge, the really putting in the effort, wanting to go beyond what the teacher has said and to really experience it and try it out for yourself. And one of the last methods is to be empathetic towards others, which I thought was really cool as well. And another quote from Book 1, Chapter 4 of the Analects, it says, "I examine my own person on 3 counts. In working on behalf of others, have I failed to do the best I can? In my association with friends, have I failed to be true to my word? And for what I pass on to them, have I failed to rehearse it myself?" And so it really is working towards having a more complete society working together and to live in harmony in a better way.
Excellent. Thank you, Alyssa. And then Alyssa's going to be putting the summary of those 3 principles and 3 practices in that chat window for you guys to compare and contrast. And then we're going to move on to Avery and the Guru Granth Sahib.
Thanks, Isaac. Yeah, my name is Avery, and the text that I delved into during our project was the Guru Granth Sahib, which is a religious text of the Sikhs and Sikhism. Just a brief background on their religion. It is relatively new as far as world religion goes, kind of came around the 14th century with Guru Nanak, who was visited by God in a vision and was told that there is only one God, and to begin to compile his teachings. And so he kind of gathered his followers by preaching to them and gathering all of his teachings into this book, the Guru Granth Sahib. After Guru Nanak, there were 9 other gurus that followed him in succession, and all wrote their teachings in this book as well. And with the 10th guru, Guru Gobind Singh, he decided that the 11th guru after him would be this book, this physical kind of compilation of all of the texts of the previous gurus, and that from then on, that would be the authority as far as their religion is concerned. This text was originally written in Punjabi, and I read the 1962 translation, and it was quite insightful. I really enjoyed reading it and learning about the Sikhs and their religion. And this book to them is truly something that they revere and honor, and is treated as, you know, a leader of a religion is. The book is kept in a special part of their house, and they read it and sing the hymns, the ragas from the Guru Granth Sahib every day. And so I really kind of took my time going through it, and they have a lot to say as well about methods of education and principles. Kind of a first principle to go over would be the kind of origin of the name Sikh. It comes from the Punjabi verb sikhna, or to learn, and Sikhs are all considered learners or disciples and seekers. And so that's kind of a base that they go through as far as living life, is understanding that there's always truth to be learned, and always truth to be shared with one another as well. There's a great deal of brotherhood and fraternity that is espoused by the Sikhs. The first principle of education that we'll go through is just kind of from a direct quote from the text. The guru writes that truth is higher than everything, but higher still is truthful living. And in this sense, they understand that the learning of truth is important, but more so that they need to live and be an example of the principles that the gurus teach them through their actions, more so than just kind of their thoughts and opinions. Secondly, they understand that the pursuit of knowledge without knowledge of the guru and his teachings is futile. So to them, these gurus and the Guru Granth Sahib is kind of the end all be all as far as teachings go. And a quote that kind of is an example of this says that, "What is the use of culture? What use is the culture of the man who, having knowledge, knows not the guru?" And so they understand that truth is kind of universally found in many different religions. In fact, the Guru Granth Sahib includes portions of religious teachings from Hinduism as well as Islam, and they understand that one of their beliefs is that no religion has a monopoly on truth, but they believe that the guru is the one who must be kind of understood to truly understand all truth. And a third principle that they kind of base their educational values off of is that the guru can help gain intelligence, but our souls are nurtured by dwelling on our inner self. And the quote that goes along with this says that the mind is instructed in the wisdom of the guru and the soul through inner knowledge. This inner knowledge kind of refers to the knowledge that God is one and he is also everything. So it's this kind of metaphysical principle that they understand that God is in every single kind of being, living plant, as the creator of all things. And through that meditation of who he is and who, our potential can be, that we, find peace and inner knowledge. And so there's a great deal of meditation and singing of the hymns that goes on to kind of gain that all-knowing truth that God has. So with these principles of education, they have many different methods that they kind of discuss, the gurus discuss in the Guru Granth Sahib. And I've compiled 3 of them that I feel to be most important. The first is the discussion of hamai, or selfishness, essentially is what it translates to, and how that must be cleansed before we can properly learn and become and understand God's truth. The essential point of this quote is that our pride must be turned to humility in order to make our mind a blank slate, to be filled with the love and wisdom of the Lord's infinite power. And they say specifically in the Guru Granth Sahib to burn thy avarice, and pounding it, prepare the ink and make thy intelligence pure like paper to write on. With the pen of love, let thy mind, the writer, write on it, as the Guru instructs. Where write thou of his praise, of the Lord's name, and of the wisdom that he is infinite. So an important step in going into any kind of pursuit of truth is that we first look inward and make sure this hamai is cleansed. The selfishness, kind of, they break it down a little bit more and talk about how it goes into 5. I was thinking 7 deadly sins. It's 5 evils that they break it down: pride, lust, covetousness, selfishness, and falsehood. And so this is kind of an important step before truly being able to understand the guru's teachings. A second method that they discuss often is that when one is contemplating how to know God and his truth, one must first understand who they are learning from and must meditate on God and his being. And the quote I ascribe to this principle is, they say, "How wilt thou mount up to him without a ladder to see him? Without meditating upon him, who, pray, is thy enlightener?" So as I mentioned earlier, meditation on God and who he is and on truth is an important part of Sikh tradition. And the gurus write in a large portion of the Guru Granth Sahib simple praises and venerations of God. And that's something that they take to be an important step in understanding his truth, is meditating on who he is and having reverence for him. A third principle, or a third method, of education is that recitation is not an adequate learning method if one is to interact with truth. Enlightenment instead comes from knowledge, comes from study and knowledge acquisition. And the quote from the Granth Sahib says that by merely reciting holy books, one does not comprehend the real worth. In order to enlighten one's mind, one must study and acquire knowledge. So along with this, living the principles that they learn, they understand that the learning process itself is important. And since there is such a great emphasis on recitation and meditation, the gurus also kind of put the caveat in there that the study of the Guru Granth Sahib is just as important as the reciting of it. They have a lot of different principles that go throughout the Guru Granth Sahib, but these 3 principles, education, and these 3 methods are some ones that they find to be most important as they go throughout their learning journeys throughout their lives.
Excellent. Thanks, Avery. So Avery will throw those on the chat window, and we'll hear from Ariana and then Anna, and then we will open it up for some more discussion with some broader questions. So go ahead, take it away, Ariana.
The tradition that I've been studying is Daoism, and within Daoism there are various texts, but the primary text that I was looking at was the Daodejing. Then I looked at 8 different translations of the Daodejing. It was written in Mandarin originally, and so it's been translated into English, and those were what I was studying to get a broader understanding of what it teaches. There are 81 chapters in the book, and it was written in 600 BC, and it's credited to Lao Tzu, who is the founder of the Taoist tradition. I'm going to dive right in. The first principle of teaching and learning that I have found as I've studied is that knowing and not knowing are complementary, which may sound, what's the word? Contradictory, but that's how it's put. In chapter 2 of the Daodejing, it talks about existence and non-existence being incompatible. And it goes on to say, the difficult and easy are mutually opposites, just as long and the short, the high and the low, the loud and the soft, the before and the behind are all opposites, and each reveals the other. In chapter 22, there's a quote that says, if you want wisdom, empty your mind. So you gain wisdom by getting rid of everything that is in your mind. In chapter 48, it says, one who seeks knowledge learns something new every day. One who seeks the Tao unlearns something new every day. So while you're learning, you're also unlearning, because you are becoming more like the Tao, which I will get to later on. The second principle is that you need to be supple and flexible in who you are. It's a characteristic that the learner needs to possess to be able to learn. Otherwise, you become broken. There's a quote in chapter 76, I'll just read part of it. It says, those who are stiff and rigid are the disciples of death. Those who are soft and yielding are the disciples of life. The rigid and stiff will be broken. The soft and yielding will overcome. So this principle of being able to be teachable is very important in the Daodejing. The third principle is that knowledge is connected to the Tao, or the eternal, which the Tao is one of the definitions that the Daodejing supplies, is that the Tao is eternal and everlasting. In chapter 16, in 2 translations, it talks about how knowing eternity, or the Tao, makes one comprehension makes one broad-minded. Breadth of vision brings nobility. Nobility is like heaven. The heavenly is like Tao, and Tao is the eternal. So as you come to know more, as you empty your mind and gain this knowledge, or this unlearning, you become more in harmony with the Tao, which is one of the ultimate goals of Daoism. Moving on to the methods of teaching and learning. Again, this is going to sound contradictory, but there is no real set method that is prescribed in the Daodejing for how to learn. It's kind of everyone who follows this way of life that is Daoism just has to find their own path to seeking the Tao, and that's since that's the goal, there isn't one prescribed way to do that. In chapter 64, it says, the master seeks no possessions. She learns by unlearning. Thus she is able to understand all things. This gives her the ability to help all of creation. So within Daoism, just to give some quick context with this quote, well, in the Daodejing, primarily it talks about a sage or a master, like it just said in this quote. And the sage is kind of the ideal to strive for, the exemplar of becoming one with the Tao. So in the Daodejing, as it talks about teaching and learning and the Tao as well, it frequently references the master or the sage to explain this. And that's what we see in this quote, that the master learns by unlearning, and thus is being able to understand everything. A second method is that it can't be directly sought after. Again, going back to that quote that I shared earlier in chapter 22, it talks about if you want wisdom, you have to empty your mind. So you can't seek after it, or else you are going to lose knowledge. In chapter 14, a portion of this quote, it says, it's talking about trying to find the Tao, or trying to find this higher understanding. It says, we try to grasp it and do not get a hold of it, and we name it the subtle. With these three qualities, it cannot be made the subject of description, and hence we blend them together and obtain the one. So the Tao is this mystery that those who are following this way of life are continually trying to comprehend. And along with that, the last method is that by being and becoming more in harmony with the Tao, you're able to achieve that higher learning. And this is mainly through more characteristics of being humble and open-minded. A quote that I found that I really liked was in chapter 16. It talks about seeking to obtain an open mind, seek composure, all things are in process, rising and returning. To move toward destiny is like eternity. To know eternity is enlightenment, and not to recognize eternity brings disorder and evil. Knowing eternity makes one comprehensive. I shared this earlier. Comprehension makes one broad-minded, and that breadth of vision brings nobility, which is related to the Tao, and the Tao is eternal. So as you become more in harmony with the Tao, you gain that higher understanding of everything, since that is kind of what the Tao is. It's inexplainable because it encompasses everything, and that is what those that follow the Taoist tradition are striving for, is to be in harmony with the Tao. So those are just three principles, three methods of teaching and learning that I've found in my research. I'm sure there are more, as the Tao is so many things. There's always more to learn and more to find, but those are three that I found and wanted to share.
Excellent. Thanks, Ariana. And we have Anna last of all, and then we're going to kind of break out into some more discussion. So keep those as we're putting these principles and these practices in that chat window. We invite you to kind of get those balls rolling in your minds about what some questions you'd like to ask each of us. Maybe some principles that we've seen in common as well. So take it away, Anna.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, as Isaac said, my name is Anna, and I chose to study the Hindu tradition and the Bhagavad Gita. And I just wanted to preface this by saying that Hinduism is one of the most ancient religions that exists, one of the most ancient traditions, and it just encompasses so much. And so as I attempt to talk a little bit about it, I do not wish to essentialize it whatsoever. I recognize that I have a very limited understanding of the Hindu tradition, but I have sincerely really enjoyed my study of the Bhagavad Gita, and I hope that I can share some of the central principles and methods that I have found, because it really has been truly illuminating to study it. So to start off with, Isaac and we originally decided to study the Bhagavad Gita because we were interested in Hinduism, because they have this Gurukula system in which gurus are the central teachers of the Hindu faith. And in order for a student to be able to approach learning adequately, they need to have a guru as their guide. And so I just found that really intriguing. And so looking into it more, we studied a number of different texts, including the Rig Veda and the Mahabharata, but we ended up landing on the Bhagavad Gita. And the reason why is because I think it's really beautiful, because the Bhagavad Gita is actually a dialogue between Sri Krishna, which is the mortal embodiment of the god Vishnu. So he's this avatar that approaches Arjuna, who is a prince. So the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, okay, to begin, the Bhagavad Gita is just an episode that is contained within the Mahabharata, which is a religious text within Hinduism. And And so the Mahabharata details this great battle. And in that battle, Arjuna is a prince, and this Sri Krishna, he approaches Arjuna as his spiritual guide. And so the Bhagavad Gita details this dialogue between Arjuna, this prince, and the literal embodiment of a god. And so it's a really beautiful text that is a direct dialogue, or believed to be a direct dialogue with a god. And so it has some really beautiful ideas, and I think they're important to apply in the context of a religious education. And so one of the first ideas that I found was really interesting was primarily the idea of the guru-disciple relationship. And one of the central ideas found within this overarching topic was that it is important for the disciple to approach the guru with a sincere desire to learn. Because I don't know how many of you are educators, but I think it's obvious that if a student doesn't truly want to learn, then they're not really going to learn a whole lot. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea. And so one of the quotes that I found, and I'll copy and paste it into the chat so that we can all read it together. And this is Arjuna approaching Sri Krishna, who's the avatar of the god Vishnu. And this is what it says. So Arjuna, at the very beginning, he approaches Krishna and he says, "Krishna, you can dispel all doubts. Remove this doubt which binds me." And so Arjuna recognizes the divinity within Krishna, and he approaches him with a sincere desire to learn. And then following this initial quote, after Arjuna approaches Krishna, is where we find the dialogue where Krishna goes over different principles, and he elucidates different important aspects of faith and how it is that Arjuna can learn, truly learn, and seek spiritual knowledge for himself. And so that is one of the first and foremost most important principles that I found is the guru-disciple relationship, and the importance of the guru, or of the disciple, to approach the guru with a sincere desire to learn. And so after that dialogue, at the very end of the Bhagavad Gita, there's this really beautiful moment where Krishna closes with Arjuna, and he closes these teachings, and he leaves Arjuna with a call for himself to begin to seek out his own disciples that he can share the teachings that he has learned with. And so I'll copy and paste that quote into the chat so we can all read it together. Here it is. So here's what he says. This is Krishna to Arjuna. He says, "Do not share this wisdom with anyone who lacks in devotion or self-control, lacks the desire to learn, or scoffs at me. Those who teach the supreme mystery of the Gita to all who love me perform the greatest act of love. They will come to me without doubt. No one can render me more devoted service. No one on earth can be more dear to me." And so this falls within the principle of teaching is the greatest act of love. And that really stood out to me as this god, Krishna, tells Arjuna that these things that he's learned are very important. And the greatest act of love that he could perform for his god, Krishna, would be to share it with others. And that if he does this, that no one could perform a more devoted service, that no one could be more dear to Krishna than to share these things that he has learned. And that really stood out to me as someone who hopes to be an educator someday, that it truly is a really important calling and important service. And then one of the third principle that I found, there are many principles, but this is the third that I chose to share today, is that of non-competition. Because one of the important ideas in the Bhagavad Gita is that of dharma and fulfilling one's own dharma, whereas everyone has their own individual path to enlightenment and to self-realization. And so by comparing and contrasting yourself to other people, that is just not effective. It actually is harmful to the disciple, as it distracts them from their own dharma. And so this is a quote that I found that I wanted to share with you all. And it reads that it is better to perform one's own duties imperfectly than to master the duties of another. By fulfilling the obligations he is born with, a person never comes to grief. No one should abandon duties because he sees defects in them. Every action, every activity is surrounded by defects as a fire surrounded by smoke. And so something that I found important in that quote is that it is better to perform one's own duties imperfectly than to master the duties of another. And so on the path of learning and the path of seeking spiritual wisdom, it is more important to be true to your own path than to compare and contrast yourself to others on their own spiritual journeys. And so that is the third principle that I found, which is that of non-competition. So now moving on to methods that I found within the Bhagavad Gita. The first method that I found was is that action is the telos of learning, which is to say that the purpose of learning is not just learning in and of itself, but the purpose of learning is to motivate towards action. The purpose of learning is change. That learning is not the end, but learning is the means to action and to change and to becoming one with God and to self-realization. And so one of the quotes that I found that I wanted to share with you all is this. There it is. And this just reads, "The immature think that knowledge and action are different, but the wise see them as the same. The person who is established in one path will attain the rewards of both. The goal of knowledge and the goal of service are the same. Those who fail to see this are blind." And I think that kind of speaks for itself, where it says that knowledge and action, that people that think that knowledge and action are different are actually incorrect, whereas the wise see them as the same, where knowledge motivates towards action. True knowledge is manifested through one's actions. I thought that was a really, really cool and beautiful idea. And so that's the first method. The second method that I found was that of meditation. This is really important in the text, as throughout, it's interesting, the Bhagavad Gita, it's kind of divided, where Krishna goes through and tells Arjuna about 3 different yogas. So there's that of Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga. And so as he goes through these different yogas, each has its own different type of meditation. And so it's really central to the actual methodical learning that is prescribed in the Bhagavad Gita, as I understood it. And so, like, for example, this is one of the prescriptions for meditation as a way to ponder on the things that Krishna is teaching Arjuna. And this is what he says. So in order to meditate, one closes their eyes, studying their breath and focusing their attention on the center of spiritual consciousness. The wise master their senses, mind, and intellect through meditation. Self-realization is their only goal. Freed from selfish desire, fear, and anger, they live in freedom always. And so that is just one of the ways that Krishna taught Arjuna to meditate for himself on the things that Krishna was teaching him. And then, yeah, so those are the principles and methods that I found within the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm excited for us to be able to discuss a little bit more. And I hope that you all have some questions so that we can have an opportunity to chat and to discuss. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna. Thanks everybody for hanging in there. It was quite a lot to digest in such a short amount of time. But we have a couple of options moving forward. I think at this point, we'd love to hear from you. I got a few questions in the chat window. Just type private message to me. One was about the kind of the nature of the project and the processes we're going through. The question was about whether we had interviewed adherent scholars of each of these traditions to kind of present the things that we'd found in these texts and see how they dovetailed or maybe shot beyond the mark in some of these traditions from the perspective of an adherent. And that certainly is a stage that is to come. At present, the research has been primarily textual, in that we've gone through these primary source documents and also consulted authoritative commentary from scholar adherents or theologians within these different traditions, but certainly building up to a stage in which we would get more involved with interviews with adherents of these faith traditions to understand kind of what we're seeing so far. We have a question to get started here. We have a question from Dan in the chat. Thought-provoking representation. This project investigated educational theories of non-Western religious traditions through a close reading of sacred texts. Interesting to expand the project to religious traditions that don't have sacred texts per se. For example, Navajo, Santeri, Congo tradition. What are the implications for educational theory or philosophy if texts are not central? What are the epistemological assumptions that make texts central? We certainly dealt with this a great deal. I don't know, maybe Jessica can talk about kind of the problem that we dealt with in terms of even the problematic nature of canonicity itself within Buddhist traditions. I don't know, maybe you can talk about that for a second, Jess?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. This is definitely a problem we ran into with Buddhism. Just the vastness of the canonicity, that there are text upon text upon text of things that the Buddha potentially may have said, or, you know, who even knows who recorded these things and what's most important, and there's contradictory things written. And so it was really difficult to identify a text that we could even say was authoritative or had information that dealt with teaching and learning that we could rely on as being representative of anything related to Buddhism. And so we ultimately turned to the Nadanakotha just because it tells the story of the Buddha's life. And that was something that we could pull principles and methods out of without having to go down rabbit holes of text and text and text. And so I think it is a good point that according to our Western Puritan bias, we turn to text to look for the central core ideas, but that isn't always where to look for those things. So I know with Buddhism, we kind of turn towards the mythological stories that guide the followers of the Buddha, that they turn to his story and try and follow the same path that he followed. And so maybe with some of those other religions that don't have text, that might be a similar path that could be taken, is instead of looking for what's written down, look for those oral stories and those traditions that are passed down that people look to understand and to gain knowledge. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts about that from what you've researched, but.
Well, it was certainly that we encountered as Anna and I, she was explaining, we kind of dove into textual traditions within various Hinduisms, and read about the influence of British researchers in India in kind of essentializing Hinduism from a Protestant bias, to try to say, well, we're coming from a Christian tradition and we have a central text, so you're coming from a Hindu tradition, what's yours? And kind of maybe pigeonholing Hindus, or at least into kind of saying, oh, well, the Bhagavad Gita is something that's really popular, and maybe we'll present this if we're kind of forced into that box. But certainly we tried to kind of avoid that and say, well, we're not trying to essentialize and kind of artificially pigeonhole this as a central text, but just to say that herein, like Anna was saying, is a text that is very pedagogic in nature, that kind of swirls around this individual one-on-one dialogue with kind of this avatar of a deity. So I think trying to illustrate our motivations for why we chose certain texts isn't necessarily to say that they're central to a particular tradition, but that they're kind of illustrative of pedagogic principles to some degree. Maybe Anna, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I think important to what you were saying, Dan, would be actually interviewing individuals that are participants in the faith. So if you're talking about the Navajo tradition, I think it would be really important to interview certain individuals that are regarded as holding information that is central to the faith. Because, and I think it's interesting with Hinduism is it was originally it was an oral tradition. And it was only written down because there was a war in the region where Hinduism was central at the time. And so they wrote it down as a necessity because they were afraid of losing their faith. And so with that, I think with these oral traditions, I think it is important to go to the source and to those who are trusted with the sacred teachings. And so, as Isaac was saying, we have reached out to some scholars from other universities. Like I know with Hinduism, we've reached out to some professors from universities nearby that focus on Hinduism, and so we hope to interview some people as well that we can talk to that have more of an understanding of the faith from the perspective of someone that holds that faith, if that makes any sense. So yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Anna. We'd love to open up to, further questions. Does anybody have any other questions for each of the researchers as we discuss?
Or I believe Jessica, were the 4 sites part of your reading of the life of Buddha?
No. Sorry. I don't recall reading anything about the 4 sites in the Nadanakotha, but I can look into that for sure.
Yeah, I think maybe in partial answer to your question, Chuck, is that rather than kind of, and I think maybe to Dan's point as well, rather than kind of essentialize each of our bodies of research and say, okay, now like the Buddhist approach to pedagogy is this, and kind of say we're going to incorporate kind of all the dimensions that we can of different Buddhisms to the text that we chose. We really tried to say we're kind of going to mostly go, other than kind of giving a little bit of context to know the tradition from which the text comes, to really focus on only those principles that appear in the text in which we studied, if that makes sense. So within the Nadanakotha, like Jess was saying, the kind of mythological presentation of the different incarnations of the Buddha, no mention of the 4 sites came into play.
Right.
But certainly is it would be a central dimension to kind of a broader perspective of Buddhist epistemology, but didn't appear in the text.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. There, the visions or the sights that he had were so experiential, that were so transformative and to his life in terms of what he said and how it changed his perspective, and even his whole seeking and searching, going from extreme to extreme before discovering the middle way. And I think that middle way is so significant also as something to learn from and to understand.
Yeah, certainly. In fact, maybe transitioning into more of the kind of the broader threads that we saw kind of connecting between these traditions. One of them, like you talked about with the Buddha's life and the experiential nature of his searching, is something that certainly Jessica encountered, and also Ariana encountered in the Daodejing. I don't know, maybe you guys want to talk about that a little bit? Maybe Ariana could start.
Yeah, so I've kind of mentioned this as I was going over the principles and methods, but since the Tao is something that's unexplainable, but is the goal to be in harmony with it, just and the fact that there's no set method on how to get to that point, really, it's like the method, I guess, is like living with the Tao, so experiencing it, becoming, that whole idea that it can't just be something that you're told and that you understand, but that it has to be something that you live so that you understand it. So that ontological versus the propositional, like knowing and being, that was very central to Daoism, and I know to Buddhism as well.
Did you want to?
Yeah. So in what I researched, a lot of this kind of stems down or comes down to the idea of direct knowledge versus notional verity, is the terms that a woman named Karen Armstrong used to describe these. She talked about the difference between notes on a page and music. So you can have these notes on a page and understand what that means. If you're a musician, you can look at that and understand what the music wants you to do, but that is entirely different from the experience of creating or hearing, participating in the actual music. And so this is, we saw this throughout Buddha's life as he tried out different methods, just kind of like what you were talking about, Chug, where he tried these extremes of, living in the pleasure palace of his father, and then trying out asceticism, and for years and years, just denying himself of any desire, and then ultimately realizing for both of those that was not the way to gain the knowledge that he was seeking, or the happiness that he was seeking, the freedom from suffering. And so he had to try out these different methods. And as he tried these things and gained different qualities, the Nadanakotha specifically talks about these 10 perfections that he gained as he was sacrificing things and treating others with kindness. He gained these qualities and became a Buddha. Rather than just learning the path, he became the path.
Yeah, maybe, along kind of this broad thread that's connecting our different traditions here about this ontological knowledge versus propositional knowledge, this knowledge that you can be and become and live. Maybe Avery can talk to this a little bit. One of the quotes that she shared from the Guru Granth Sahib about truth is great, but even higher than truth is truth lived. Maybe could you maybe find that quote? I mean, I kind of just paraphrase here, Avery. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you almost got it. It's one of the quotes that kind of starts out the introduction to the Guru Granth Sahib, which is their collection of prayers, is contained in that introduction. And they say that truth is higher than everything, but higher still is truthful living. And a big goal of kind of meditating on these teachings of Sikhism is to return to live with God, not necessarily in the Christian sense that there's, a savior doing this, but that our gaining of knowledge of him and of truth will lead us there at the end of our life. And so another important principle that they talk about often is that one cannot enter God's place unless truth permeates in the mind and the body. And so there's definitely this connection between knowledge that we gain through reading and recitation versus knowledge that we gain through experience, and kind of similar to one of the principles of Hinduism that Anna was talking about, that service and knowledge are deeply intertwined, and that our service to our fellow man is an important step of living that higher truth. And so the Sikhs practice this quite often. Their kind of main temple is constantly a soup kitchen. In a sense, they serve 3 meals a day and they're free for everyone. And so that principle of brotherly love, I think, is one of the ways they express the truth that they're gaining through the Guru Granth Sahib. And when that's expressed, that's kind of a indicator that you have been living truthfully, as well as learning the truth that's contained in the Granth Sahib.
Thanks, Avery. Yeah, so I think, between all the things we've been talking about thus far with this thread of direct knowing ontological truths versus propositional or notional verities, even Alyssa's description of virtue and its role in Confucianism is not so much focused on a prescribed curriculum or certain content areas that are important to the development of the whole person, so much as living that which you have studied, of becoming the things that you are learning. There's a conspicuous absence of hardly any text in any of these traditions, these texts that we studied, that talk about what you should learn, so much as there's an abundance of descriptions of how you should be as a result of your learning. Do you have any thoughts on that, Alyssa?
Yeah, sure. So like Isaac was explaining, in the Analects, Confucius often gave steps or things for people to do, but those steps are often not recorded or seen as a very personal thing for each person, because in the end, the goal for their learning, the importance was their virtue, that they had to be able to shine through and to exist in its purest form without being diluted by unnecessary practices or sin or wrongdoings. And so really the importance wasn't do this or do that. It was more of a discover how you can help others, how you can help yourself, how you can learn to be a good member of society and a good person for yourself, to let that virtue really, really shine and be the purpose of that learning.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you, Alyssa. That's awesome. I think so seeing these threads, these commonalities has been one of the most exciting parts of this project, I think, to consider something's going on here, kind of that describes a broader viewpoint or perspective of the human experience, when principles of knowledge and descriptions of the purpose of learning kind of overarch themselves across traditions, some of which have direct influence on one another, some of them do not. Here's another question from Norma. We have a question that says, in each of these religions, how are children regarded? What about elders or men versus women in the tradition? That impacts who is the teacher and who is the learner in these traditions. Also, how is the outsider regarded? Can one learn from an outsider to the tradition? What is the role of men and women, and what is the nature of the relationship between teacher and learner? Are those separate roles? Are those held equal to one another? I don't know, maybe Alyssa could answer some of those questions, maybe from the Buddhist perspective.
I mean, Confucius. Yeah, so in Confucius tradition, in the Analects, learners and teachers are men. Women were not seen as someone that had that virtue in order to learn. But despite that, there's still some wonderful teachings, and I have enjoyed studying about the Confucian religion found in the Analects. There's one part where Confucius explains that everyone is actually a teacher to everyone around them. And that if you are walking down the road with someone who is traditionally good and fantastic and better than you, you can look at them and you can learn things from them and see good things in them that you want to emulate yourself. And if you're walking down the road with someone who perhaps is not as good and is bad and just terrible influence, not a good member of society, you can see what they are doing, and you can look within yourself to see if you have any of those qualities that you can change about yourself to become a better person and a better student and teacher as well. And so in that way, Confucius believes, as seen in the Analects, that everyone can teach everyone and learn from one another, and that the teacher-student relationship is more complex, as we all seek to learn from others around us and have everyone be our teacher, but also to be a good example and to be a teacher towards others.
Avery?
Go ahead. I was just going to go kind of off that question as well, because I think it is really interesting when you consider who is kind of in positions of authority in these different traditions. And specifically, according to the Guru Granth Sahib, as far as the teacher goes, the words of the Guru kind of hold the most weight as far as authority goes. However, Sikhism being kind of a product of the religions, it was kind of conceived around that being Hinduism and Islam, has a very open view of other religions and understands the Gurus discuss, specifically Guru Nanak, the first Guru, that, Sikhism, he himself as a servant of God does not have a monopoly on truth, and that all religion can be can have truth in them. And so one of the quotes that he is kind of ascribed to often is that a person belonging to Sikhism is one that contemplates on the religious teachings of all. And so he understood that, this kind of sacredness and reverence that surrounded trying to be, live in a higher way and understand higher being was important. And so that, there's a great respect for all religions, and it's quite easy to, become a part of the Sikh religion if that's something that an outsider is necessarily interested in. They're very welcoming. As far as men and women go, as it was kind of indirect, a lot of the traditions are in direct response to certain aspects of society in India at the time. And so they were really kind of against the caste system and different things like that, and believed and wanted to teach that all human beings are equal. So there's not a lot of delineation between men and women as far as their roles in the religion goes. Both can be kind of leaders in prayer and leaders in their temples. The only kind of differences you see is in their dress and the different kind of rituals that they participate in, but both can be in positions of power. And mothers specifically are often revered throughout the Guru Granth Sahib as kind of leaders in their family. And so I thought that was quite interesting, and is definitely these different dimensions are kind of responses to the time that Sikhism was created in, and is in contrast to some of the other teachings and traditions that we've discussed today, but in other things is the same in a lot of different ways.
In the Nadanakotha, there's, just because you asked about children specifically, and this story came to my mind from the Nadanakotha. So when the Buddha left his father's palace, he left his infant son, who had been born that day. And then when he returns back to visit his family, his son is still a child. And his son comes to him and asks him for his inheritance of gold and silver that he should get as the child of a prince. And Buddha's response is to tell him that he has a better inheritance or treasure for him, and brings him into their group and ordains him as a monk. And so he joins as a child, and that was somewhat distressing to his mother. And so then there was a request made to not bring children in until they were old enough. But I think that demonstrates that Buddha recognized that there was a place for children there to learn, that it wasn't outside of his son's reach to begin learning these things even as a child. So that's just a note about children from the Nadanakotha.
Excellent. Oh, Ariana, go for it.
Yeah, so really quickly as well, in the Daodejing, there are a couple verses in the chapters that talks about becoming like a child again, and having that, it says simple vision, and then being able to see everything with absolute precision is what it says. And it also talks about like knowing the strength of a man, but keeping a woman's care. And then it talks about the balance between yin and yang, and like having that harmony. So, which I think is really awesome. Just embracing like everything that is good, no matter whether it's a masculine or like traditionally a feminine trait, or the child is seen as something or someone that they want to become like, because they see everything so simply. And that's the goal in that I've seen by studying the Daodejing. And yeah, I just wanted to share that.
Excellent. Thanks, Avery. Oh, sorry, Ariana. We have a question. Noel, you have your hand up?
Yes, thanks. I noticed and thanks for all of the presentations. It's a nice summary of the lots of different things. I noticed in the listings for each of the religious practices and principles, a couple of them are quite explicit about testing what one is presented with. And others are kind of imply it, and then others don't seem to pay any attention at all to the matter of testing what you are asked to learn. I'm just wondering, in some of them, what are the specific ways of testing what one is being asked to learn? And I ask that from a social scientific angle and background, where how one tests the accuracy and adequacy of what one is asked to learn has been studied for years. And I'm just wondering what some of the specific methods would be proposed in 2 or more of the different traditions that were presented today.
Excellent question. Thank you. Does anybody want to take? We probably have time for maybe 1 or 2 of us to answer that. Jess?
Yeah, so something that the Buddha repeatedly said was he wanted the people to try out what he taught, and then the results of their testing was their answer of if that was the right path. And so as he would teach, he would say, go try it. And then his students would go out, and as they tried these things or were able to grasp and understand and gain a direct knowledge through their action, they were also able to achieve different levels of understanding until they ultimately reached enlightenment as well. And so for them, it was a test of if it works, then it's true or it's right. And so that was kind of his method of encouraging them to test it out, was just, I've told you this thing, now go try it. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, try something else.
In the Analects, one of the first things it says is that it is pleasant to learn with constant persistence and application. And in the way that Confucius taught was that everyone needed to try it out and do the actions, because the doing was the most important part in his mind. And so when his students would return to him, there wasn't very much of a written test to see if they had mastered it. He would just observe how they interact with others and how they put it to practice. And then, so in the way of schools with testing, Confucius would be probably, according to the Analects, against written tests, but more just seeing how the kids solve problems or interact with people in their real life. And also that it's just a continual process, and even just failing to do so but trying is still a step in the right direction.
Excellent.
Both of those sound quite individualistic, both of your responses. And I'm wondering, is there a communal aspect of learning in the general way we think of in scientific approaches to knowledge? That it's not just because it works for me or it works for you, but because there's sufficient evidence compiled over a period of time that this approach or that approach works for not just a few, but for many, and certainly not just for myself.
You know, I certainly think there are certain uniting features. So in Alyssa's description of that verse in the Analects, from a Confucian perspective, that there is a single thread. So he's describing a communal dimension to that thread. They don't go in all sorts of directions. There is a thread, but part of that thread has many smaller threads that are individually catered to certain circumstances, but there's a unifying dimension to it. And then also, you know, Anna discussed in the Bhagavad Gita how Arjuna is taught that fulfilling your own role imperfectly is better than trying to master the role of another. Certainly in the rest of that text and elsewhere in the Mahabharata, it's not that every single individual has entirely unique roles that are unlike others at all, but that they're grouped in certain paths that are communal in and of themselves. And certainly while there's customizability within those, to be able to have that communal dimension, there's kind of a double-sided coin there, that it's communal and individual, both. But yeah, thank you for that. And thank you everyone so much for a great session and for those wonderful questions. We're so grateful for your time. And we hope that you enjoy the remainder of the conference. And if you have any further questions, please feel free to send an email to us. We have our contact information is available through the conference website, but there's my email as well. So thank you again and be well.